I'm excited to be presenting today on high maturity Scrum project management with the process dashboard, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. I'm going to start off with a little bit of background, what I mean when I talk about high maturity Scrum, and some of the ideas that go into that, and then from there I'll talk about some of the best practices for how to use a high maturity approach to run a Scrum project. I'll give demonstrations using the process dashboard, which I'll come back and talk about in just a moment. This will cover the initial planning sessions for a project, the Scrum Zero as some people might be inclined to call it. Also how iterative cyclical development happens on a project and how replanning happens. I do have slides, but I'm going to also be leaning heavily on actual demonstrations of how things happen in the software, and then we'll also leave some time for questions at the end. All right, so obviously all of us are familiar with Agile Scrum. We know that over the past couple of decades, one of the most significant advances in project management has been a move away from waterfall, the waterfall style project management, and a move toward rapid iterative development. It's obviously an industry best practice that has a huge number of benefits. Within different rapid iterative development approaches, by far the most common is Scrum. Scrum obviously embraces change as a competitive advantage for the customer, and through the use of short cycles gives teams the opportunity to get software in the hands of the users and get feedback quickly to enable not just very quick correction of mistakes, but also very fast pivots in case the customer changes their mind on where they want the software to go. Obviously, when you're running a Scrum project, some of the bread and butter tools that almost every mainstream Agile project management tool will offer is the ability to manage a backlog, the ability to understand, plan and track using velocity, and the ability to see the flow of work through your project using kanban, and the ability to see your progress using burn down charts. So those are all pretty standard. Now, within our organization, the Software Excellence Alliance, there are quite a few people here that will also be familiar with something called the team software process. But for those who are joining us, I'll give a quick background. The team software process was developed also at the turn of the last century, basically in line at the same time as Scrum and other Agile methodologies, as basically just like Scrum and other Agile methodologies, TSP was developed kind of as a pendulum swing back away from that heavy-handed top-down project management philosophy that had been proven to perform poorly on software development projects. So the team software process is also an Agile method that introduces some very high maturity concepts and a framework for planning projects, tracking your projects, and managing the work that you do. One of the exciting things about the team software process is that it does provide some extremely valuable or a metrics collection framework and analysis framework that provides unparalleled quantitative decision-making support, and also provides the ability to manage the quality of the products that you're producing. So, for example, to know that the software that you're delivering to the customer, to basically have an idea of how many defects the customer is going to find when it gets into their hands. One of the other things that the team software process has been, one of its deepest strengths is that it really provides some great ways for teams to make and keep commitments. And so the commitments that teams are able to create with this team software process, it's very common for teams to be able to commit to deliver within cost and schedule on their promises to within 5 or 10% error. And it does this by giving teams access to a very lightweight implementation of industry-proven concept called earned value management. Now, TSP provides all of these different parts of the framework, but it really allows the team to choose the iterative development strategy that works best for them. So Scrum is one of the choices that a TSP team could use, but any of the other typical ideas that Scrum is certainly not the only one. If we've got somebody who needs to mute their mic, if that would be, if they could do that, that'd be great. I apologize, but since I'm not using a headset, other people's audio is going to feed back into my mic too. Okay, so obviously all projects are not alike. And so this is something where it's important for a particular project team to take a look at their customers' needs, because projects fall along a spectrum. Obviously one of the strongest benefits of Scrum is that it provides teams the ability to work in a very volatile environment where the requirements change constantly. And in fact, it enables teams to take that and leverage that volatility as a customer advantage. But not every project has requirements that are that volatile. Some projects have requirements that are more stable, and sometimes you may be working, for example, on a minimum viable product and have a pretty good idea of what it needs to be, and have several months worth of work ahead of you to get that thing built. But so the bottom line is not all projects have extremely volatile requirements. Similarly, from cost and schedule, we've had presentations in the past. To the Software Excellence Alliance, we had a presentation within the past year from one of our longtime members who came forward, and the title of his presentation was "Schedules Don't Matter." Well, it's true. There are a number of teams that schedule doesn't matter anymore, and customers are just happy with a continual flow of software. But that doesn't describe every customer. There are some customers that are happy with that flexibility and just happy with the continual stream, and there are other customers that may need to know when a particular piece of software is going to be developed, or they may need to know how much it's going to cost. And just because your customer needs to know whether something can be delivered by April 1st, it would be kind of cheeky for you to go back and say, "Oh, you're not an Agile customer if you need to know a date," obviously. So if a customer doesn't have extremely volatile requirements and they're not wanting to pivot at the end of every sprint, and they have something that they need delivered and they'd like to know when you're going to be delivering it, it'd be great for us as a team to be able to give them a commitment on when that could happen and to be able to follow through with that. And so obviously some customers would really like that capability, and we would like our project iterative development strategy and our tools to support that a customer's need in that way. And then of course there's another aspect which, on this spectrum, which could be if you're working in a safe type environment and you're trying to scale this up and you have a number of teams that have dependencies on each other. Obviously you'd like to try to decouple those as much as possible, so that teams aren't waiting or blocked by things that other teams are producing. But when you get into a situation where you do have teams that are waiting on each other, and each team then becomes a customer where they really need the team that they're waiting on to be able to make a promise and keep that promise. And so the cross-team dependencies once again introduce this concept where we really need to be able to have an idea of when something might be delivered. I mean, the good news is that Agile methods like Scrum can be applied across this entire spectrum with tremendous success. And I guess the challenge then is that many of the mainstream Agile tools that we're familiar with, whether that be Jira or Azure DevOps, et cetera, provide great support for highly volatile projects. And the support that they provide doesn't always, out of the box, meet the needs of projects that want to deliver something by a particular date, et cetera, and have a strong sense that they'll be able to meet that commitment. So the process dashboard is an open source application that I develop and write. It's available for download free of charge. So I'm not here pitching a product, but just telling you about something that you can use if you're interested. So the process dashboard is an open source application for Agile project management. It supports a number of different project management styles, including Scrum. It also, as Julia mentioned, provides great support for a lot of these different high maturity behaviors, including a lightweight planning and tracking framework based on earned value. Now, one of the nice things about this lightweight planning and tracking approach is that it's designed with a user interface that's designed to minimize the overhead of planning. One of the challenges that Agile teams often have with planning is that it can be a time-consuming process that ends up being sunk time if the customer's needs are changing rapidly. If the customer's needs are changing rapidly and you have to spend time rebuilding a plan every time they change, then the value in creating that, the return on investment on that plan becomes low. So one of the things the dashboard strives to do is to make it where the generation of the plan is so requires so little effort and so little attention, and it does as much of the heavy lifting as possible, so that you can just make a couple of changes based on feedback you get from the customer, and the plan is automatically recomputed without any effort on your part. So it's designed to help you change course quickly, even if you do have a customer with volatile needs. And then one of the things where the process dashboard really shines is that it uses comparison of the actual project progress and the data that you're collecting during your project, compares that back to your plan to identify planning errors, and then use mathematical models to correct for those planning errors and generate automatic forecasts that say when the work might be done. This can give you a great, really early warning in terms of problems. One of the examples that I like to share is that the very first time that I used this earned value planning and tracking technique, I was working on a project for the Air Force. We had a release plan that spanned about an 8-month period, and 3 weeks into our 8-month period, we could already tell that we weren't going to finish on time. 3 weeks into an 8-month release plan. And that early warning and that early forecasting gave us the ability to, immediately start looking at contingency plans, or going back and working with the customer and figuring out what we could change in order to make sure that we would meet their needs. So Process Dashboard does provide a lot of these capabilities, and I'm really proud of the high maturity support that it provides. So one of the things that I'd like to share today is how to align those tool features with Scrum as an iterative development strategy to make sure that the tool is working for you and not against you. One of the challenges that I find is that since Scrum and TSP both grew up about the same time in parallel with each other, they developed their own vocabulary and their own sense of definitions for certain words. And unfortunately, some of those words overlap and have different meanings in the two different areas. That can lead to confusion. And that confusion can sometimes cause people to use a tool in the wrong way. So I just want to kind of talk about that a little bit. So this is one of the misconceptions that I see most commonly. The Process Dashboard supports several of these high maturity concepts that came from TSP, including a team project with iterations. A launch is kind of a planning session that you do at the beginning of a 2 or 3 month long cycle in order to plan out the work for the next increment. And TSP also has things called weekly meetings, iteration postmortems, and relaunches. And because the word iteration shows up in both Team Software Process and in Scrum, some people tend to think that an iteration basically maps into a sprint, and that sprint planning is basically the same thing as a launch, and that the daily stand-up on a Scrum team is similar to the weekly meeting in a high maturity or TSP team, that the retrospective is similar to the postmortem, and that the relaunch corresponds to the sprint activity of backlog grooming. So this misconception, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that teams might run into if they try to apply a high maturity approach to a Scrum project. And so what I'd like to show instead is the correct mapping for these different terms. So in the high maturity approach, a team might put together a team project with iterations. And the Scrum concept that matches that most closely is not a sprint, but is a product release or program increment. Different teams use different terminology. You might call it a program increment, you might call it a release. But that larger group of work, program increment or a release that might be 2 to 4 months long, is what maps most closely to the concept of an iteration in team software process. So in that sense, the team software process's high maturity planning session maps very closely into what Scrum would call release planning. And the weekly meeting that high maturity teams generally do includes aspects that basically encompass everything from sprint planning to the daily stand-ups to also the sprint retrospectives. All of those things basically fall under the same umbrella as the TSP weekly meeting. And then the TSP's postmortem at the end of an iteration is the same thing as the retrospective for a release, not the retrospective for a sprint. And the relaunch in the TSP concept really maps to what we would think of as grooming the release backlog. And so this is basically perhaps the most important thing, especially for people coming from the high maturity background, wanting to understand Scrum. I hope that you take this, that you come away with this as the, maybe come back and look at this slide later to make sure that you map the concepts well in your head. And I'll just pause for questions before I continue, see if there are any questions.
David, this is Jeff Schwab. There's not a question, but I just wanted to give an example. We have a very major, large program in Navarre. They've stood up a SAFe, a scaled agile framework. They're using PI cycles that are quarterly, so 13 weeks long. Mm-hmm. First week is just what you're saying, planning the 6 sprints, 2-week sprints that they're going to do in that quarter from the first week based on high-level requirements. And now they're also looking at aspects of the team process and process dashboard features to help them better estimate and plan the details of those sprint cycles. So we're really seeing this being used, best parts from multiple methods and tools. Over.
Fantastic, great. And I did see a question in the chat that was asking about the team software process. And yes, you're correct. Team software process was developed as an agile method by the groups, by individuals at the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And so I think that in the chat, there is a link to a technical report that was published back then basically during the early days of team software process, showing some of the benefits that they had found from it. So yes, thanks for sharing that link, Imran. Okay, I'll just keep moving forward then. So in terms of, within the process dashboard provides the capability to plan and manage projects, very similar to, say, Jira or ASDO. So the general recommendation here, I'll just start off, is that when a team is using Scrum and wanting to pursue a high maturity approach, they would use the process dashboard and they would create a team project within the process dashboard that would model basically their upcoming release or their upcoming program increment. And then within that team project, let's see, and I'll just, I'm going to, let's see. All right, I'll go ahead and touch on these items real quickly, and then I'm going to demonstrate it briefly. So within that project, they would also take advantage of the team member list to capture the availability of the different individuals on the project, and they would create a backlog component in their work breakdown structure to brainstorm the items as far into the future as desired. So I'm just going to give an example of this with the process dashboard. So as I mentioned, within the process dashboard, we can create any number of projects. I've created one here to give an example of a Scrum project. We would be using the work breakdown structure editor to put together our plan for this project. As I mentioned, we would use the team member list to capture the different individuals who are members of our team, and we would capture their capacity to participate in the project in terms of how many hours per week they're going to spend. And then looking into the future, we can say that certain people won't be starting the project until later, for example, or we can say that certain person's going to be out of the office on a particular week, or we might say something like the entire team is going to be out for the holidays on that particular week, etc. I won't go into this in too much detail because it's pretty straightforward. This is the interface that the process dashboard offers to allow teams to capture the capacity that they have and how that capacity changes from one sprint to the next. Now you'll notice that the dashboard is using hours instead of just velocity in terms of story points. One of the reasons for that is that story points are vary a lot from one individual to the next. I mean, story points are very much a team measurement concept. How many story points a team can get done in a week, and the amount of time it might take one person to write one story point, etc., might vary slightly. So we use hours in order to produce estimates that are more reliable and more meaningful. Okay. Now within the work breakdown structure, we also, for a team that's using a Scrum approach, I would recommend that they create basically an item in their work breakdown structure to represent, basically as a folder to represent the backlog, and then they would start putting items underneath it. And backlog grooming is something that's pretty well understood by teams, so I won't do a lot of that here, but just will point out that if you've done some pre-planning in another tool like say Excel or whatever, then copy and paste is supported so that you could just paste in a number of new items that you want to be in your backlog. And I'll just make this a little bit bigger so it's easier for everyone to see. So it's certainly possible to copy new items into the backlog that way. Within here, it's also possible to enter items like notes or other labels in order to capture assumptions, document any ideas or things that you don't want to lose track of when you, as you're putting these backlog items in place. All right, moving right along. The next step for a high maturity Scrum planning approach is to identify the planning horizon that's important based on customer need. So does your customer only need visibility into the next week? Do they need visibility into the next month? Do they need visibility into the next quarter? So that planning horizon based on your customer need, will drive the level of detail that you put together in your plan. So for highly volatile teams that want the opportunity to pivot every sprint or two, your planning horizon might only be the next sprint or two. But I would say in general, most teams aren't quite that volatile, and most teams do need to think a little bit into the future and be able to make some commitments to their customers. So for most teams, I think it's going to be pretty common for them their planning horizon to be at least the next program increment or the next release, which would generally often be 2 to 4 months. Perhaps this is something that you would be looking at quarterly. So once you've identified that planning horizon, then during the high maturity project launch or the sprint zero, whatever your team is calling it, you would seek to understand the work that's going to be done within that planning horizon and to plan the work that will fit. Within the dashboard, we're going to be using planned hours to come up with the estimates for that work. If your team is comfortable estimating in story points, it's pretty easy for you to use a conversion ratio to come up with basically a nominal conversion of the story points that you estimate into hours, and you can tweak that as you need to. And then the dashboard is going to provide colored bars at the bottom to gauge team capacity. So let's just look and see how this is done. So in this example, I've looked at the different items that might be in my backlog, and I've come up with, in my case, estimation tables. These estimation tables, you could imagine, would be similar to planning poker cards. So in our planning poker cards, we might say that we've got these different cards in our deck for very small new features, all the way up to very large or extra large features, and maybe we've got a number of story points for each one of these cards, and we know that our general rate is that it takes us about 4 hours to do one story point. That might be something that comes from our team's past history and knowledge and expertise. We might have a different concept, since we don't generally use story points to estimate defects or bug fixes. That's not generally done. We might have a separate table here for, this is kind of like planning poker cards for bug fixes, but we might have simple, average, large, or complex bug fixes that we know generally take a given point in time. You can create any new items that you want here in terms of, let's see. There were certain things that we might, for example, we might know that we're working on older systems, and on older systems we might need to make changes, and those story points might or might not be the feature that we might use to do that. But let's say for legacy changes, we might say that an average legacy change is about 100 lines of code, and that and it generally takes us about 20 hours. And so from that, with just that little bit of information based on what we know our things have taken us in the past, the dashboard can help put together planning poker cards for you if you don't have a lot of data. Of course, if you do have data on work that you've done in the past, then you're certainly welcome to fill this chart in completely with real data from real historical data that your team has collected, so that you know that the numbers that you're producing are estimates that are based on historical patterns. So once we've got these different estimation tables, and you can create as many as you like, we can come back in and we can say that, well, let's say that I'm working on a number of new features and maybe some bug fixes and maybe some legacy changes. And then as a team, we might go through and use planning poker to say, well, this one's going to be large, this one's going to be very large, this one's going to be small, this one's going to be extra large, this one's going to be very large, etc. Now, what you'll notice at the bottom is that there's basically a bar chart shown at the bottom that's comparing the work that we've estimated so far to our team capacity. So it's taken this number of hours and the number of hours we said our team had to work, and it's figuring out nominally how quickly we could get this delivered. You can see that we're already 3 sprints into the future just with the stories that we've estimated so far. And so if I keep going, I might say, well, this is going to be small, medium, large, small. Obviously, we'd be using a real planning poker process here to come up with this. So at this point, we can see that we already have a pretty sizable amount of work cut out for us, and that work might take us until February 13th of next year to finish. So just nominally here, without a lot of effort so far at all, we've already got kind of an idea of our team capacity to deliver the software that's in our backlog. Okay. So moving on to the next thing. Within the process dashboard, it's also possible to create arbitrary milestones. On a Scrum team, I generally recommend that we create milestones representing the different sprints. And then we can also create milestones that represent important dates or concepts like a particular release or program increment. And then I also recommend that we create a milestone at the end called the backlog that we use to tag basically future work that we're not planning on estimating in detail during the current planning horizon. All right, so let's see what that looks like. I'm going to show you the milestones that I created for this particular project. This particular project, I just defined milestones for each of the next 6 sprints. This particular team is using 2-week time boxes, and so I've got sprints running every 2 weeks. And based on that, I've said that our planning horizon is to try to get our next release, which is release 3.14, put out, and we generally have that set up for promise to the customer by January 12th. So that's the date we're planning on delivering. So in this case, you can see I put together these commit dates, and those commit dates appear on the capacity planning chart at the bottom as basically little flags or lines in the sand. And I've also created an item here for the backlog, and well, I'll show how that works in just a moment. So at the moment, we would generally start by saying that that all the items underneath this backlog component are tagged with the backlog milestone. Let's just start that out in general terms. Now let's see, I'm going to just, so all of our item is in the backlog right now. At this point, we might start saying something like, let's see, like, all right, let's put this in sprint 1, and let's put this in sprint 1, and it looks like sprint 1 is full. Now let's put this in sprint 2 and sprint 2. And what you'll see down here is that sprint 1 is using a different color, sprint 2 is using a different color. We can see that sprint 2 is already overloaded a little bit. And so we're not going to be able to get all that work done in sprint 2, partially just because story point 4 is so large. We might need to break story point 4 into a couple of different pieces, and let's just go ahead and do that for the sake of being able to give our customer let's call this 4A and 4B, and I'm going to go ahead and say that this is a new feature, and I'm going to make these both, let's see, I'm going to take this 80 and I'm going to break it in half. Of course, as a team, we would need to try to figure out what the definition of done was for the first part and the definition of done is for the second part, but we would have an opportunity. Now we've got enough work that just fits into sprint 2. And we could come in and start saying we've got sprint 3, etc. So we're just working our way through and trying to figure out what our capacity is as a team. Obviously, it's nice that we can, that every time we make a change, so like let's say we come back and say, you know, this feature, this particular, we used planning poker and it said that this was 52 hours, but when I really think about that, I'm not sure I'm confident about that number. I think this is probably going to be closer to 67 hours. And the moment you make that change, the capacity planning bars at the bottom update too, and we can see how it's affecting us as a team. So you get that immediate feedback on putting these things together. Now, for our purposes, we might come through and we might say that, let's see, I'm going to go ahead and put things through sprint 4. And let's see, here's sprint 5. And we've got another one of those big items that's not going to fit. So we might put this one into sprint 6, but you get the idea. At some point now, we see that we already have more work than can fit in the release. Here's our release. And so we might have to look at a particular item like this one and push it back into the backlog again. And now it looks like we've got work that is pretty well balanced and the team can possibly tackle in terms of putting things together within the, and being ready at the end of sprint 6 for us to release. Now these items that are planned for our next planning horizon, I would generally take these and I would move them out of the backlog into the main project. And then that gives me the opportunity to basically collapse the backlog and just take a look at the work for the current project iteration. In fact, for the purposes of planning now, we have an idea of what's going to fit into our planning horizon. And I would say, I just want to balance work through the end of the release and not look at the work that's in the backlog anymore. And now I can focus this bar at the bottom just on the work in the current release. I could, if it, while I'm planning, I could also go in and I could say that I would, maybe I just want to plan work for the next couple of sprints and really get a good idea of what those are going to take. But basically I have the opportunity to balance. At this point, I'm just going to leave it balanced through the entire program increment. All right. So that's basically a quick look at how the capacity planning is going to work. Okay, so just moving forward, I'm going to take a look at the next step, which is that, oh, actually, one last item. Within the process dashboard, we also have the opportunity to capture the concept of definition of done. And so for the different types of work that your team does, you might have different things that are on your checklist for the definition of done. So for writing a new feature, this team might say that the first thing that they want to work on is prototyping that feature and then taking a look at whether or not the plans were correct, putting together a design, getting their team members to look at that design, writing the code, getting their team members to look at that code, making sure that the integration is finished and that everything's checked off with the continuous integration, and then getting basically a review from the product owner. So this might be their definition of done for a new feature, but you can have as many of these definitions of done as you like. Here's perhaps a definition of done for a bug fix, which is different. Like, for example, it doesn't have the product owner review. And then they might have a special definition of done for trying to understand and assess technical debt and remediate it. But you can have as many of these as you like. I'm just giving these as an example. But within the dashboard, once we've created these definitions of done, we can go in and we can say, well, I'm going to use, for this one, I'm going to use the new feature workflow. And it creates basically a work plan underneath that. I can come in and do that for as many of these as I'd like, and it'll just basically create a detailed plan for all of these things. I might say I'm going to use just for demonstration purposes, I might apply the bug fix workflow to these things and the technical debt workflow to those. But not only has it created a detailed plan for all of these items, but it also has taken the effort that we put at the total work effort that we've estimated for the work item in general, and it's broken it down based on basically our historical patterns in terms of how much time these different things might take. This breakdown is really useful because it gives us better insight as we're working into the basically into the progress and whether we're ahead or behind. Sometimes, for example, you might not be able to finish it might take you most of a sprint to get 32 hours worth of work finished. But because these subtasks are smaller, you can see progress along the way and see whether or not you're on track, basically to to burn down all of this work by the end of the sprint. Now, some of these larger items that we had looked at before that were so large that they might span in more than one sprint. For example, I think I had one, this is 61 hours. We might have to take some of this stuff and say that we're going to get the design done in sprint 1, but the implementation might actually flow over into sprint 2. And all that's fine. Okay, so moving right along, the next step is that, once we've put together a plan like this, a detailed plan like this, we have the opportunity as a team to begin working on it and tracking our progress. And so as we work on it, the best practice here is obviously to embrace everything that we know both from Scrum and from High Maturity, from TSP. That includes things like holding daily stand-ups and iteration reviews at the ends of sprints, but also doing personal reviews and peer inspections of the work that we produce, the work products we produce, and obviously also building automated unit tests and using continuous integration and all the best practices of DevSecOps. Obviously, you want to pull in, all of the team best practices that your teams are already using. And then the one thing, just as a kind of a reminder to people who come from high maturity background, I would encourage them to pick up the sprint planning and retrospective activities and do that basically for the high maturity people who are used to using like a TSP weekly meeting. Those sprint planning and retrospective activities, sprint retrospectives, might be things that take place during the TSP meeting or vice versa. All right, moving right along. If you're using the process dashboard, there are a number of reports that are available. Earned value is one of them, and I just also will point out that it does offer views similar to those that you get in Jira or Azure DevOps, for example, a Kanban view of the work. And I'll just stop for a moment here and give an example of some of the charts that that teams would generally be using when they are working on high maturity. I'm going to give an example of, giving an example of this is a large program that's been underway for some period of time. We can see that they have a plan for how long the work is going to take in this particular program increment. We can see that they're behind. This particular project is made up of 3 sub-projects. So if I drill down in, I'm going to see that of these 3 sub-projects, one of them, the Amber project, is on schedule, and the Chestnut and Sage projects are behind. So like if I were to try to drill down and say, well, what's up with the Chestnut project? I could pull up their project and I could say, as an example, go in and take a look, and I could see that this project is falling behind. And the reason they're falling behind is because the team had planned to have a certain capacity, a certain number of hours they could work per week, and they are not getting those hours in. Maybe they're getting pulled off on other projects, or maybe they're getting distracted by crises in production that they have to support, or maybe they're all senior individuals who have to provide architectural advice to other projects. But the bottom line is that they are not getting in the number of hours that they thought they would get. And so basically their capacity is lower than they planned. If I drill down on this, I might see that, in fact, that this particular team has 5 people. And although everybody's having a little bit of a challenge getting in the number of hours they thought per week, there's one person who's really having a lot of trouble, and that's Alan Turing. And apparently he's really, his capacity was basically overestimated. He thought he might have a certain number of hours per week he could devote to this project, and that estimate was wrong. So based on that, we have the insight that we need right now to go in and adjust our plan moving forward. So what's our plan going to be? Are we going to change Alan Turing's capacity? Or are we going to fix whatever is causing Alan Turing to be pulled off of our project continually? But we can have those conversations with management or we can resolve the problem internally as a team. Or similarly, we can take a look and we can say that on this project we saw that the Chestnut team was falling behind, but let's see, the Sage team was also falling behind. If we take a look at the Sage team, we can see that they're falling behind. Let's see, just taking a look. They're falling behind, but for a different reason. It looks like they are actually able to get, they're actually meeting the capacity that they thought they would, but the problem is that tasks are taking a lot longer than expected. We can just see that here. The number of hours they're getting in per week is similar to what their capacity was, but the number of hours that the work is taking is more than the number of hours they thought it would take. Work is just taking a lot longer. So basically, what this means is that the team was able to estimate their capacity really well, but when they sat down and estimated how many story points each work item was going to be, their story point estimates were all under. And so basically that caused them to bite off more scope than they could chew. And so that's a completely different problem than the capacity problem. And it's going to require a completely different remedial solution. But it gives them the opportunity to, for example, talk with their customer and say, all right, we need to take a look at the backlog and reduce scope and maybe identify some items that will get pushed off into the next program increment. But they have the opportunity to do that, and they have the opportunity to, basically the early warning that needs to happen. And most importantly, you can see both of these two teams were behind, but for totally different reasons. And it's important to have the insight into the fact that those reasons were different for the two different teams, so that they know the right corrective action to take. One of the things that we've discovered within the high maturity community is that if your corrective action plan is work harder, that corrective action plan will almost always fail. You got to understand kind of the 5 whys. Why is it that we're behind? And get down to the root cause and fix that root cause. And so this data helps you to, the high maturity data that the dashboard is helping you gather is giving you that insight into fixing the right problem. All right, so just going back, I did mention that the Kanban view for people who come from a high maturity background and not from a Scrum background, you might not have been aware that the dashboard does provide a Kanban view, but it is there, and just highlight it there for you. For people who come from a Scrum background and not a high maturity background, I would point out there's a chart that the dashboard offers called the Tasks in Progress chart, which is a great chart that helps you not only see what the team is up to, but spot problems. For example, a particular work item that if there was a particular work item that you thought was going to take 12 hours, or thought it was 10 story points, and it turns out to be much larger than you thought it was going to be, then this work in progress chart basically gives you really quick feedback and insight into that, so that you can identify which work items might be having trouble, and basically see if those things might need replanning or attention, or if you might, like the team might need to come in and help a particular individual with that particular issue or work item. All right, and then moving right along, one of the concepts in high maturity project planning is the idea of a relaunch, which is that you get to the end of a program increment and you take a look at the work that you finished and the work that still remains, and you basically close your current iteration and look at it, do your retrospective, and then create a new plan for the next cycle going forward. In high maturity, that's called a relaunch. In Scrum, it's possibly called backlog grooming. But the idea is that you basically look at your next program increment or your next release, which is maybe another 2 to 4 month planning horizon. You have an opportunity to do that, your sprint zero kind of planning over again, and identify what work's going to fit into the next program increment. So my advice to the folks coming from high maturity background is that relaunch, where you draw a new stake in the ground, it's not something you do at the end of every sprint. It's something you do at the end of every release or the end of every program increment. and that when you do that replanning session, it's an opportunity for rigorous backlog grooming, where you take a look at all the items in the backlog, reprioritize them, re-estimate them based on the most up-to-date information, and move forward into planning your next release. All right, and then I just want to point out a couple of known limitations for the dashboard that come from the way the dashboard works that makes it a little bit different from Jira and ASDO. One of the items is that in Jira and ASDO, people using Kanban often pull work from the backlog on the fly. Unfortunately, the dashboard does not support that. It requires you to go ahead and pre-allocate and have people sign up for work during your program increment planning session. And then, of course, the other item is that work does need to be broken down into tasks, but the process concept there in the dashboard makes that pretty easy to do. If a particular team is not very mature and these programs are showstoppers, they can use the colored bars as a fallback and basically just purely, not use earned value to track the project, but just purely use kind of capacity planning bars that are in the WBS.